Joshua is Professor of Christian Ethics and a governing body fellow of Harris Manchester College and lecturer in theology at Jesus College here at Oxford. He read classics at New College, Oxford, and then went on to some postgraduate study of theology, first at Oxford, and then on to doctoral work in Edinburgh, working with Oliver O'Donovan. And went on from there to several posts at Cambridge before coming back. There seems to be the irresistible magnet that pulls Josh Hordern back to Oxford. He manages to do important research in at least three quite different areas: political theology, healthcare, and artificial intelligence. Important contributions that I have drawn from over the years include his monographs, Political Affections and Compassion in Healthcare. He also has edited just a host of volumes on topics ranging from integralism and Christianity and liberalism to diakonia and personalized medicine. He's very active in leading a range of organizations, including as director of the Oxford Healthcare Values Partnership, the co-founder of the Oxford Collaboration on Theology and Artificial Intelligence, PI of Christian Political Thought for British Public Life, and is a principal investigator for Augustinian Resemblances and senior fellow of the McDonald Center for Theology, Ethics, and Public Life. And it's probably also worth mentioning that he has for a decade been a member of the Faith and Order Commission of the Church of England. So this is somebody who is very actively serving the church as well as the academy. And I want to mention, hot off the press, A Voice in the Wilderness, Why Should We Listen to the Church of England? And it would be interesting to find out who the we is here, who's doing the listening. Edited by Joshua together with Graham Tomlin. And to give you the full title of the talk, which isn't on the screen in front of you, today's talk is Diagnosing Medical Humanities, Conscience, Christus Medicus, and a Common Life in a Fractured World. So please join me in welcoming Josh.
Thank you, Jennifer, very much for your warm welcome. And thank you to Luke and to the McDonald Centre for the invitation to speak today. Here is the full title for the talk. So if one says fracture in a medical context, one might think of a broken bone. The fractures which are relevant in this paper are less visible than a bone and have a different kind of importance. One such is a fracture between theological anthropology and a certain kind of biologism. This may be further specified in terms of a fracture caused by that part of medical humanities literature which attenuates the significance of conscience in our common humanity. Our hope in this gathering is to reimagine humanism, and to do so with respect to common life in a fractured world. And this paper's approach is to examine an aspect of public culture in universities and in healthcare which aims to meet a perceived need for humane learning, for educational formation, picking up a theme which I think was in our first paper from Slava. And that focus on educational formation is medical humanities, or more expansively, health humanities. Now, I'm going to stick with the phrase medical humanities today, but note at the outset how the term medical can be, if narrowly conceived, it can tend to focus attention on doctors at the expense of a much wider range of healthcare practitioners, or indeed the interplay of patients and healthcare staff. So I don't endorse those tendencies, but I'm going to stick to the language of medical humanities. Just to give you a quick overview of where the paper is going. First, I'll give a brief introduction to medical humanities. Second, review some critiques or diagnoses of the state of medical humanities. Third, consider whether this critique or these critiques are overdone by providing some wider context, especially engaging with features of Islam and the tradition of Islam in relation to medicine. And fourth, give a case study on conscience, before fifth, situating the whole discussion in Augustine's interpretation of Christ as Christus Medicus. That's where we're going. So first, medical humanities, a brief introduction. I want to begin by declaring a fundamental sympathy with the endeavour of medical humanities. It represents an important, sustained humanistic effort across many disciplines. And a fruit of this effort is the prominence now given to narrative in medical humanities and in many cases in the very practice of healthcare. So most, if not all, work in narrative medicine rejects the claim that those dimensions of human persons which are susceptible of investigation by scientific analysis and technological intervention are the sole proper focus of healthcare. So it's hard to find many people who would, on careful reflection, affirm such a position. And indeed, over the centuries, professional medical cultures have incorporated various kinds of humanism in healthcare practitioners' care of people. So I won't belabor this now well-established point. Attention to the narratives of patients and healthcare practitioners is now a stock in trade in the industrious work of medical humanities scholars and many healthcare practitioners. What's important for us is how medical humanities aims to sustain healthcare environments as a place of humane encounter, thus enriching this particular aspect of our common life. And yet, with this said, there's a real risk to humane common life to which medical humanities is responding. A standing temptation, which is a particular form in healthcare, to reduce humans to their pathologies or symptoms or disabilities, or indeed their mortality. Responding in part to this temptation, the multidisciplinary field of medical humanities has had a good run for a while now, at least in many Western medical schools, with courses opened up and new funding opportunities, and with theological or theologically inspired or religious voices often playing significant roles in shaping what it means to have a humane healthcare system. I come now then to some critiques of medical humanities. So how well has this field done? What implicit or explicit notions of the human has it encountered and mediated, engaged with in some way? To set the stage, I'll now briefly outline three differing critiques of medical humanities, those of Jeff Bishop, Seamus O'Mahony, and of co-authors Jordan Mason and Ashley Moyes. First, Jeff Bishop, a doctor and philosopher theologian, in an important article entitled Rejecting Medical Humanism, Medical Humanities and the Metaphysics of Medicine, he voices his complaint as follows, quote, "There is an implicit philosophical anthropology in medicine's study of humans, and that philosophical stance is that a human is the animal machine in need of something else," close quote. Bishop remarks that this anthropology invites those who attempt to humanize medicine to fall into a trap of instrumentalization. He says, the story goes something like this. We need the humanities in medicine because in some sense the humanities will once again humanize medicine. In other words, let's give medicine and medical students a dose of humanities so that medicine can become once again humanistic, close quote. So this is what we'll call the additive instrumentalization diagnosis. Medical humanities appears on the intellectual landscape as an additional extra which explores this extra bit of humanity which is not machine. In Bishop's critique, this, quote, extra bit is the humanity of persons or the narrativity of his or her story, close quote. However, by becoming entangled in this paradigm, medical humanities merely strengthens the hold of a more or less implicit biologism, running counter to a desire for a humanistic culture. Bishop's diagnosis is that medical humanities has all too often become the compensatory addition of the humanism of the humanities to the biologism of the scientists. So much for the additive instrumentalization diagnosis. The next critique is that of O'Mahony, again a doctor and philosopher. He targets the medical humanities' focus on narrative. He takes a more radical line even than Bishop. Bishop, he remarks sarcastically that, quote, the act of writing itself, the narrative act, is a production that invests the biological, that is to say, the really real parts of a human being, with meaning. O'Mahony is similarly sceptical, but even more punchy regarding a utility justification for medical humanities. While allowing a place for medical humanities and providing what he calls hinterland and perspective, he comments that, quote, narrative medicine is spiritually arrogant and potentially harmful. It encourages doctors to stray from their core professional duties into uncharted waters, to take on roles such as spiritual advisor, social worker, life coach, or friend. So O'Mahony's scepticism of training doctors in narrative, or narratology, a term he refers to with disdain, in some way recalls Galen Strawson's famous 2004 essay Against Narrativity. With his bedside experience, O'Mahony takes the argument into what he sees as the corruption of professional practice. Here's his view. Narrative medicine encourages sentimentality, that is, the expression of emotions that one does not truly feel. The narrative medicine imperative to express an empathy, which the doctor may or may not feel, cheapens, undermines, and coarsens the relationship between patient and doctor. Older, more stoically inclined patients in particular may find this form of engagement with their doctor vulgar, embarrassing, intrusive. Punchy stuff. Counter, therefore, to a humane common life. That's the point. So let's call this the sentimental narrative overreach diagnosis. A last voice completes our mini-survey of diagnoses, taking us deeper into our fractured condition, but also offers a signpost towards therapy, taking a rather different view than O'Mahony. So Mason and Moyes, they focus on one particular dimension of medical humanities, namely clinical ethics. Their proposal to live in a world of deep difference is what they call ethics as struggle, and I'll come back to that quite a bit. Here's what they say. Ethics as struggle acknowledges that clinicians today inhabit fractured institutions and contested moral worlds, where the goods internal to medicine must be continually discovered and rediscovered. So their understanding of struggle resists the idea that the purpose of ethics, or indeed medical humanities more broadly, is to create more efficient doctors who are soothed from their distress and become more productive. Ethics, they believe, quote, does not resolve the tensions of medicine, but it teaches us how to live within them faithfully, close quote. So with some similar emphases to both Bishop and O'Mahony, they hope this understanding of clinical ethics will, quote, resist its co-option into bureaucratic structures aimed at increasing productivity rather than moral insight. So let's call this the productivity efficiency critique or diagnosis. And here they all are. Those are our three diagnoses in our diagnostic suite. The additive instrumentalization critique, the narrative overreach critique, and the productive efficiency critique. However, Mason and Moyes, having delivered their critique, offer a more positive take on narrative, which cautions against overdoing a critique of medical humanities. They develop their account of ethics as struggle in the following way. They say, the patient is not merely a recipient of ethical or medical expertise, but an active participant in the moral struggle. From that insight, they claim that, quote, their sufferings, that's the patient's sufferings, hopes, and humanity press upon the practitioner, compelling them to interpret the patient's story, listen to their narrative, and co-imagine a path forward. This imagining together is itself an ethical act, shaped by a shared vulnerability and a mutual striving towards health, flourishing within illness. I think clear resonances with many of the themes of our gathering. Here then we have common humanity appearing in multiple focused encounters, organised by imagination, but from within fractured institutions and a contested world. What more do we need to learn about ethics as struggle to gain a more positive appreciation of medical humanities? Mason and Moyes observe how, quote, narrative reimagination extends practitioners' interpretive work by unsettling what has come to seem settled. Here, learners and practitioners are invited to re-narrate familiar clinical routines such as informed consent, triage or discharge planning, among other experiences, from diverse moral perspectives, ranging from the patient to the nurses, from the family to the institution, close quote. And this reimagination includes, for Moyes and Mason, exploring histories which pay attention to injustice. These histories, they say, reveal what it is like for whole peoples to see themselves through the revelation of the other world, enclosed by the straight and stubborn walls of ignorance that form a prison house. So what then does struggle achieve in medicine for Mason and Moyes? Medicine as a practice, they say, involves a complex interplay of skills, knowledge, and virtues. Therefore, engaging in such interplay allows medical professionals to discover and rediscover the moral dimensions of their work. Now, as Bishop admits, and as Moyes, Mason, and O'Mahony also acknowledge, critiques of medical humanities can be overdone. An accurate diagnosis will see signs of health as well as signs of malady. And those signs of health may provide the requisite ways of thinking of humanity so as to avoid the risks to which the critiques attend. And I give here two relevant illustrations among many of such vital signs which will prepare the way for later parts of this paper. First, I was at a conference some time ago of cardiologists and theologians and philosophers, interesting group of people, at the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, such a thing still exists in London. A wonderful society. And at that society, I came across Faye Bound Alberti's work on the heart. She was keenly conscious of the effects on the human imagination of heart transplants and developments in cardiology generally. Her research, ranging across literature, history, theology, and ethics, leads to important insights regarding the heart. And she's bordering on the problems identified in the additive instrumentalization critique. Focusing on those kinds of problems, she describes a core disjuncture in our discourse as, quote, the heart of science, that is a pump, versus the heart of culture, close quote. Problematizing any neat division, however, she also observes the strange meanings clustering around the heart as pump, especially when it is transplanted. She notes how, following transplant, a certain line from the Song of Solomon might assume a new haunting meaning. That dead person who donated a heart might cry with that famous line, I sleep, but my heart waketh. More generally, she observes how, quote, science has failed to conceptualize the meaning attached to the heart in ways that could make irrelevant or replace traditional beliefs about its emotional embodiment. The reason why this is so is that it has been constructed in opposition to, rather than in integration with, a holistic interpretation of the body. Close quote. The further connection I would make here is to important Jewish and Christian scholarship on emotions, a theme we've been hearing about a little earlier, on emotions and the heart, which can extend Bound Alberti's analysis to address the maladies our diagnoses have identified, via a Christian humanism. And this requires a deep sense of the conversion of the affections, a focus which I have learnt and relearnt from the late Hans Ulrich and especially recently from Brian Brock, who's here. The invitation which Bound Alberti's work makes is for medical and health humanities to engage in ancient beliefs about the heart, such as those found in millennia-old Jewish, Christian, or Islamic traditions, which have imaginatively interwoven scientific scholarship and investigation with humanity's complexly bodily interdependent life. It was the Islamic scholar Ibn al-Nafis who, in a 13th century Common Era commentary on Avicenna's canon, reported his discovery of the pulmonary transit, the passage of blood from the right to the left ventricles of the heart via the lungs, a discovery which, while limited in scope, was a revolution in understanding the heart, overturning the accepted wisdom of Galen's classical anatomy. Such knowledge was, of course, widely in circulation across Europe. Just so Chaucer, in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, introduces the doctor of physic thus. Well knew he the olde Asclepius, and Descorides and Igruthus, old Hippocras, Halley, et Gallium, Serapion, Rhazes and Avicen, Averroes, Damascene and Constantine, Bernard and Gatskin and Gilbertine. That's my schoolboy A-level way of reading Chaucer. Taught in 1998, I'm sure others can do better. So there's a huge amount of communication going on, clearly, around medicine and philosophy and so on across this period, which we do well to remember. The second point, which really follows the theme of the celebrated ways that physicians' knowledge of humanity has through history bridged classical Jewish, Christian and Islamic civilizations, is to turn to some hopeful signs in medical education. It was Al-Ghazali who particularly celebrated anatomy because, he said, it made man understand God's providence in the wonderful structure of the human body. And this theological insight speaks to a wider understanding in Islam of the unity of humane and scientific modes of learning in relation to medicine. A Qatar-based medical humanities educator observes how, quote, Islam has never endorsed a binary two-culture split in humanistic and scientific knowledge. In this light, there are clearly extensive possibilities for health humanities education in Islamic context today. And this seems to me a promising area for further inquiry in pursuit of the questions of our gathering. I note, for example, a fairly recent, unusual pedagogical experiment to develop medical humanities in a medical school in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The motivation was a concern shared with medical humanities approaches from outside the Islamic world about the dehumanizing of doctors and thus of relations between healthcare practitioners and patients. But it goes much further, in this particular case, by seeking to avert the tendency that Muslim doctors become, quote, oblivious of the supreme healer, the creator and sustainer of all life, Allah, the beneficent and the merciful. That's the intent which lies behind this pedagogical innovation. These innovators note that unlike developments in medical humanities in many Western medical schools, quote, with a few exceptions, medical education in the Arab world is still following the same principles of modern Western medicine. That is, lacking any explicit engagement with humane fields of learning, but, and here is the key point for these educators, also lacking any structured engagement with Islamic faith, hence their innovation. Precisely because of the more unified religious world in which these health institutions and medical schools are operating, and crucially, the remarkable sources in Islamic history, the possibility of Islamic faith being the all-encompassing source behind medical humanities is a real one today. The opportunity they identified was to school medical students in 3 areas: history of the medicine taught and practiced during the Islamic civilization era, Islamic medical ethics, and Arabic medical poetry. And what's important here, and I think unusual in current practice, is the incorporation of poetry and history alongside ethics. How did this innovation go down? Some recorded student responses included the following. These are Muslim students in Saudi Arabia having gone through this course in Islamic medical humanities. One said, "I extremely enjoyed taking this course. It helped me to understand the morals and ethics of life and how our great religion applies it into my career." Another one said, "This course put me, as they say, right on the spot when the professor gives us an example of a situation that we might face in our daily lives as Muslim physicians and how to deal with it in the light of Islam." So there's cut through right to medical education. So this is all well and good. However, a well-informed 2024 assessment of the state of the field indicated that such humane learning is not yet widely integrated into the formal medical education curriculum across the Middle East. Tracing out the variety of such courses in Islamic context would be a further avenue for research. But what is perhaps most salient just now is how less likely it is for the practice of medical humanities in, say, the UK or the USA or continental Europe to have one explicit, predominant, religious, let alone Christian, humanism as the integrating vision. I'll return to some thoughts on this later. But for now, as a cautionary note, I observe that each of the diagnoses noted above do have potential application in the experience of medical humanities in university medicine courses, wherever they are located. Indeed, a recent survey of emerging deployment of medical humanities in Muslim contexts provided the justification that, quote, humanistic practices in medicine improve health systems, and the introduction of humanistic patterns of thought and behaviour into the technical regime of modern clinics in Muslim-majority countries should logically produce similar outcomes. Such an appraisal has features which seem to accord with the kind of additive instrumentalisation critique, although, of course, there are clearly huge resources in Islamic thought to resist such tendencies. And I note features of the self-same critique in UK contexts. A humanities element is tacked on late to an already well-developed medical funding application to ensure it's successful. I've seen that happen. A humanities curriculum is added into the training for medical students, but finds it hard to gain time and funding in a medical school. Recall Jeff Bishop's view. He says, "My critique has been that medical humanism, in its narrative iteration, offers itself in a mechanical way as the remedy, as the dose necessary for the health of the medical professional, or as an inoculation to prevent doctors from becoming bitter and angry that they're little more than mechanics." That said, I observe that in our experience in Oxford, many, though not all, medical students come with some resistance to the very dualism Bishop identifies. The mechanistic overlay on human life is liable to itself be taken apart in the humane hinterlands which medical students bring with them. And I've noticed this often in Christian, Muslim, and Jewish medical students, among others, who participate in education initiatives developed by our group here in Oxford. That initiative takes medical students on a tour through the Ashmolean Museum, for example, to consider manifold human cultures around death and dying through engaging with material objects of the museum. However, just to emphasise the point of difference from Riyadh, some responses to thinking about death and dying from 23-year-old medical students here include, quote, "I had not considered the role of faith as such before today." Okay, so moving on. Conscience as case study for fracture. So with this said by way of general diagnosis and appreciation of medical humanities and the possibilities for future development, not least in relation to Islamic majority contexts, it will be worth taking one case study to show the different dimension of the challenges and opportunity for a Christian humanism in particular. It seems to me that an apt focus for considering humanism among those who might be included within the broad remit of medical humanities is conscience. While by no means limited in significance to the field of clinical ethics, conscience does help us to navigate further amidst the ethics of struggle, which Mason and Moyes remark upon. Recall that medical humanities has been developed as an educative discipline, and both Bishop and O'Mahony are positive about that, despite their scepticism. The question is how such an education might aid us in our common humanity amidst our fractured institutions. Moyes and Mason cut through here. Their vision of ethics as struggle invites, I suggest, a focus on conscience, long conceived as a place in which various kinds of struggle and discomfort are in some way located. This also takes up Faybound Alberti's invitation in relation to the heart, long conceived in religious traditions as a vital focus for exploring an awareness of humanity before God. I need to leave aside here, sadly, interaction with Islamic notions of conscience on this occasion. There could be some useful conversation to happen afterwards, and it could form part of future research. Focusing then on the Christian tradition, Ian Clawson, to whom I'll return on a few occasions, comments that, quote, "Conscience represents a beginning point, not an end point. Better still, it is an entryway to the life we are called to live, the life of moral agency, accountability and judgment, all of which imply responsibility to the reality of the way things are, ordo rerum." With this by way of justification for focus, let us consider an influential and provocative set of voices in medical humanities showing why, engaging with them shows why conscience is a key focus for metaphysical contest. And this group, whom I will refer to as our quartet, are the following: Giublini, Shuklenk, Minerva and Savalescu. They've recently mounted a full-scale rejection of conscientious objection, a full-scale rejection of conscientious objection in healthcare. And I notice as an aside that the purpose of this paper is not to deal with the important questions they raise, or not all of them. Instead, is to detect the philosophical anthropology at work and how a Christian humanism might respond. And here then are the bones of the quartet's views, briefly, but I hope not uncharitably stated. They run strongly counter to Moyes and Mason, and as we shall shortly see, counter to St. Augustine. First, they say that conscience is inward and introspective, and so not available for discussion and criticism. Second, they say, by contrast, professionalism, in their account of medical professionalism, allows for a critical, open discussion of the healthcare professional's obligations, where they define professionalism as about adhering to the standards and expectations of one's voluntarily chosen profession. Third, they say compromise with conscience is inappropriate because, they say, patients' interests count more than doctors' consciences. And so they think there is no moral dilemma, there can be no compromise. In short, conscience should not be allowed to get in the way of the efficient delivery of legal health services to patients. Fourth, they say, in practice, for those normally religious people who argue for conscientious objection, the value of conscience, they think, is in fact less weighty than the substantive doctrine which they seek to uphold, for example, regarding the value of unborn life. Talk of conscience, then, is really a kind of proxy for wanting to advance a specific comprehensive doctrine, and so conscience can really actually just be dismissed. So what is striking about these views is how, taken singly and together, they seek to reduce the possibility of ethics as struggle, to improve the efficient delivery of legal health services, and minimise the role of conscience in anything medical humanities might contribute to the work of medicine. In response, I observe the following. 1. Our quartet's relegation of conscience to the inward and non-discursive excludes conscientious innovation and challenge from public debate. 2, their stipulation of professionalism renders flat, monochrome and inert a field of professionals which is in fact topographically, religiously, various, dappled and lively, and health services are the better for that variety. 3, their view of professional life as distinct from the agonism of plural political life sets aside the possibility that compromise and accommodation might be a beneficial recognition of ethics as struggle within fractured institutions. And 4th, their assumptions in the anemic notion of conscience as merely inward disguises from them and others their own highly disputable doctrinal metaphysical priors regarding human nature. This is a sorry state of affairs, not one to be rejoiced in, especially since such a view threatens to denude public culture of certain humane, deep, rich, metaphysical ways to recognise and honour our common humanity. What remedy then for this carefully targeted attack on conscience, and thus, I'd argue, on prospects for a Christian and indeed wider religious humanism, at least within healthcare? Our quartet's attempt to deny the conscience such significance proceeds from a view of humanity that fits well into both additive instrumentalisation and productive efficiency diagnoses. They are archetypal in wanting to add some medical humanities to an essentially anti-metaphysical view of reality, and they do so in ways which seek to significantly narrow the permitted range of moral struggle in clinical ethics and in healthcare more generally. By tightly circumscribing what counts as relevant to professionalism, they police what registers as humane in our common life, excluding sources and modes of insight which move back and forth from inward reflection to outward conversation, mediated through deep and rich religious cultures often. Ultimately, my concern is that, however unintentionally, this will deepen sources of fracture in common life and health institutions by suppressing the deepest sources of understanding of our human condition. Speaking in a different but relevantly similar context, Brian Brock comments, quote, "Conscientious objection can never be signed away by the Christian," close quote. But such objection is not understood as some private, incommunicable inner impulse, but a judgment born of self-understanding, which is generative of new possibilities for action in service of healing and peace. And again, I think creating avenues for conversation between Christian and Islamic notions of conscience could be an enormously fertile, rich environment for actually pushing back against a denuding of public culture in this space. I come to the last part of this paper, which is still long, so hope I won't try your patience too much on this evening. What then will provide an alternative vision, both concerning conscience specifically and concerning medical humanities generally, and so contribute to common life in a fractured world? We've heard in the early part of the paper some diagnosis, the beginnings of therapy and the idea of ethics as struggle in a humane healthcare context, and especially a contest about the place of conscience. Where may sources be found to heal a fractured world, to quote the title of a wonderful book by the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks? To discover sources of healing in aspects of Christian humanism, I turn in the final phase of this paper to two Augustinian thinkers, Ian Clawson of Villanova and Susan Griffiths, here in Oxford. In some thoughts on higher education generally, thoughts which I'm applying here to medical humanities specifically, Ian Clawson observes the following: to teach with a view to the act of conscience requires teaching with an openness or receptivity to reality itself. In Augustine's terms, education dances the rhythms of grace. It can only be anticipated, not achieved or controlled for, and that for the simple reason that it involves the work of conscience. Close quote. Note here that conscience is seen as a base of resistance to the kind of monochrome flatlining which characterised our quartet's approach. Clawson observes the benefits of Augustine's approach to conscience in diagnosing, quote, the difficulties any educator faces in attempting to bring students into contact with the human condition. How then to explore the condition of our common humanity? Brian Brock's thesis in Joining Creation's Praise is that, quote, stories of the beginning make the whole cosmos intelligible, close quote. In somewhat similar vein, Ian Clawson follows Augustine in meditating upon Adam and Eve. The question, he says, posed by God, "Where are you?" Genesis 3, verse 8, is to be understood as a response to our common humanity's tendency to evade blame, to displace God as judge, and to obscure humanity's place beneath the judgment seat of God. So this question, "Where are you?" is a place from which an ethics of struggle can indeed set out, an entry point for, quote, moral self-consciousness in Clawson's terms. It sets the stage far wider than merely that of conscientious objection. Brock calls this question, quote, the most important words in the primeval history, alongside "what have you done?" They are not questions about the couple's location in space, but about their moral orientation in the world. Just so, in a confirmatory remark, Ian Clawson says, to reoccupy the abandoned place of conscience, one must rehear without delusion the question, "Where are you?" It posits a kind of origin tale of the human intellectual endeavour, that in inheriting a displacement in the manner of their own existence, humans face questions about their origin, nature, and destiny that continually elude their investigations into the truth of the world. Close quote. These questions are the entry point not only to medical humanities as a human intellectual endeavour, but arguably to a Christian humanism. Ethics as struggle gains further dimensions here when that struggle incorporates the struggle with the heart's own deceptiveness. Clawson notes that Augustine's analysis of self-deception, quote, may be read to address the difficulties any educator faces in attempting to bring students into contact with the human condition. By contrast, recall the account of conscience given by our quartet earlier, an idea of conscience best suited to endorse the implicit but under-scrutinised anthropology of a certain powerful viewpoint. Does a Christian idea of conscience get in the way of efficient medical care, oriented to an individual's wishes within the law? Does conscience make a system unproductive and inefficient? If so, then give us an account of conscience such that it can become a negligible consideration. A richer account of conscience can and must respond, playing its part in the reimagining of Christian humanism. Clawson again summarises Augustine's thought that, quote, conscience is not a faculty we possess, but a place we must run to in recollecting the self. The process of recollecting the moral self before God, moreover, includes re-inhabiting the place of conscience so that God can enter us, so that God may speak to us in and through conscience. So here then is common cause to make across other parts of medical humanities, picking up, for example, Faye-bound Alberti's invitation to consider the heart in the depth it deserves. We note that Augustine understands the place of encounter as the heart. Again, Brian Brock notes that, quote, in the biblical view, the heart is our chief organ of perception. And who is encountered? Who is perceived? Ian Clawson observes that Augustine further innovates on the meaning of conscience when he suggests that who we meet in conscience is none other than Christ himself. This perhaps riffs off something we heard earlier about the life of the human being consisting in beholding God. So this brings us now face to face with Christ. Christ as Christus Medicus. I want to express my indebtedness here to Susan Griffiths. Her research, including her paper at an Augustinian Resemblances Conference, has been a vital source. In brief, the claim now to be explored is that the healing of the medical humanities from the diagnosis identified above will be found in Jesus Christ, encountered in the conscience, in the heart, and especially as Christus Medicus. The Dominical saying, which resources the motif, is found in Matthew 9, verse 12. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Brian Brock remarks, in inaugurating his kingdom, Jesus has opened a space for healing for humans as for all creation. How then to place this in an Augustinian frame? Griffiths explains how Augustine develops this thought to conceive of humanity as, quote, an enormous patient, a giant Adam, sprawled out across the whole world as a kind of sickbed. Griffiths observes that this is not a one-off image, but instead a permanent fixture in the landscape of Augustine's imagination. On almost every occasion, the image of a huge patient is used. She says the patient is directly or indirectly connected to the genus humanum, our common humanity in every place, including, say, Saudi Arabia. Griffiths describes the, quote, distinct narrative pattern with which this gigantic sick human is evoked in Augustine's sermons. Here's the pattern. Humanity is laid out on earth as on a mattress, attended to by Christ the physician, and then succeeded by the church, similarly stretched out from east to west. Here then is displayed our common humanity, and an inclusive image, incorporating all the multiple sin-sick needs of the whole fractured world, each one attended to by Christus Medicus. And we can see immediately how the image of God, Jesus, appears in a manner that it is not subject to the critiques noted above, but instead offers healing amidst the fractures and diagnoses in medical humanities. For it should be inconceivable that Christology could be a sort of additive to the really real nature of humanity discovered through biology, or that the final purpose of such an additive is instrumental productive efficiency towards temporal health. The incarnate Christ, as Christus Medicus, tenderly yet decisively declares the impossibility of this idea, but does so at the bedside of the genus humanum. But there's a further step here. Since humanity is sick, it implies that the humanities, as an overflow of the heart of humanity, are in need of medicine, wherever such humane learning is located, in Western or in majority Islamic contexts. While medical humanities is responsive to fractures and maladies in common life, it will also contribute to them. As Griffiths explains, Augustine sees Christ inhabiting multiple medical specialties to respond to human maladies. She says, ultimately, in all cases, the figurative patient's problem is deep inside and requires a good internist to diagnose the real problem intus. Since Augustine emphasizes that the root of all sin is pride, superbia, most of these images connect to treating that. What's the barrier to humility? Building on his earlier analysis, Ian Clausen comments, the desire not to be deceived or persuaded one is wrong, as Adam and Eve in the garden, distills a common obstacle to educational formation. It is a result of several factors that harden the heart, but for Augustine it can be reduced to one desire in particular, inordinate self-love, pride. Instead of marginalising the inward aspect of conscience, instead of a proud biologism, Christus Medicus invites to turn to consider the heart, the person self-consciously before God, as a vital place for humanising educational encounter. Our quartet's suppression of conscientious objection on the grounds of some flatlining professional standards is precisely counter to this vision. Turning to that opportunity, consider how Christus Medicus' representation of Jesus Christ provides the appropriate kind of humane vision to frame and sustain the vocation of healthcare work, over against that flatlining of professional vocation. Griffiths cites for Augustine's observation that it's the job of the salvator, it's the profession of medicine, that those who cannot see may see. Here then we get the interplay of the healing work of medicine in restoring physical sight and the healing work of the Saviour, enabling a kind of total sight. And ultimately, the eye doctors to whom Jesus is compared to, they make an eye salve, but in one sermon, Jesus makes that salve from his blood. Here, Augustine goes to the heart of the matter, the reconciliation of all things, including alienated humanity, through the peacemaking blood of Christ, shed at the epicenter of struggle, the cross of Golgotha. Again, we see how Christus Medicus provides a kind of bulwark against the temptation to allow medical humanities to fall into additive instrumentalization. How absurd would be the idea that the blood of Christ is the extra bit which science does not provide. On the other hand, none of the other single humanities disciplines, when sober, would dare to make claims concerning their area of expertise which can be made of Christ. We heard it earlier through Eric's talk, words to the effect that in Colossians 1, that in him all things hold together. Rather, the proper counterpoint would be a thoroughgoing Islamic vision, incorporating as above ethics, history, poetry, from within a single vision of humane and scientific learning. That, to me, is a wonderful frontier for a proper humanism in healthcare. More challenging, I think, is the sentimental narrative overreach critique. I'm going to pass over this part, but for the sake of time. But the point is that at the heart of a Christian vision in healthcare should be a way of attending to narrative which follows the late Hans Ulrich's guidance, that at the heart of healthcare we've got contests about narrative and every encounter going on in healthcare. Coming into land now. With what narrative might Christus Medicus re-narrate medical humanities itself? Perhaps medical humanities disciplines see themselves as in some way the Good Samaritan, coming alongside healthcare workers, wounded healers, themselves in need of help, offering the educational formation they need. There is real truth in this, reflecting not only the common moral self-consciousness of our common humanity, but also those humane insights ultimately descended from Christianity, which shape the field. I've seen many humbling instances of such humanistic endeavour in the colleagues from whom I've learnt over the years. However, bearing in mind the critiques reviewed above and the struggle between narratives, which is always at play, a more uncomfortable narrative from below is to see medical humanities in the place of what Augustine calls the semi-vivus, the half-alive man in the ditch, who lies there in need of the Good Samaritan, figured here as Christ. Christ, who is also, for Augustine, represented as the beast of burden, humbly carrying wounded humanities on the road to the inn. What follows? Brian Brock quotes Ian McFarlane to say, Christology governs anthropology, yes, and here governing as Christus Medicus humilis, Christ's self-humbling, enabling the multiple disciplines of humanities to contribute their best to healing a fractured world. Over against an instrumentalising logic for the humanities, we have an incarnational bearing of humanity's load. Over against a sentimental narrative overreach, we have an affective narrative of undergirding and protection. Over against humanities as productively efficient, we have the human as himself the effective medicine. Over against our flatlining quartet, Christ as Christus Medicus provides the opportunity of encountering God and humanity at the epicentre of an ethics of struggle, kneeling in the ditch, at the margins of the road, crucified outside the city. And amidst an emerging diversity of religious humanism in healthcare, Christus Medicus comes in humility. As I bring this talk to a conclusion, it's important to remember that a focus on Christian humanism is not a new departure for theological ethics. We've heard that in many different ways today. I note the 2014 Theos report on the case of Christian humanism. Rowan Williams recalls an observation in 1966, a happy year for England, I should say, at the cusp of this World Cup, by Rowan Williams' predecessor, Archbishop Ramsay. Ramsay said, Europe knew a long tradition of avowedly Christian humanism, drawn from the confluence of the stream of biblical theism from Palestine and from the stream of classical humanism from ancient Greece. It's broader than that, we know. But following this line, Rowan Williams called for a good and significant conversation in our society about where exactly our convictions of human dignity or equality or liberty come from and how they're to be defended in theory and practice. Just what our convictions are on those matters is perhaps more in dispute now than they were even 12 years ago, and certainly are richly enhanced when we think across the religious diversity within the UK, let alone across the interchanges in the Islamic world. But to this conversation, I've offered the diagnostic work of the fracturing of the common life in the medical humanities and exploration of conscience via Augustine's interpretation of Christus Medicus. There remains the task of further diagnosing the multiple fractures of the world. Moyes and Mason point us down that path. And there remains the detailed work of how encountering God in Christ as Christus Medicus might enable endorsement or critique of any particular instances of medical humanities scholarship, including in rich conversation with the Islamic world. The expectation for this Christian, at least, is that Christ is given for the healing of all our diseases, just as he is not only the beginning and the end of all of our pilgrimage, but also the way and the companion, so is he not only a doctor for the sick, but also himself the medicine for our sin-sick common humanity, stretched out across the face of this fractured world. Thank you.